everyone and welcome. Today I'm going to go over the 10 best sci-fi and fantasy books that I've ever read, according to Goodreads. So what I did, it's basically very simple. I went to Goodreads, to my read shelf, and then ranked all of the books that I've ever read based on average rating. Now, of course, in things like these, it's very important that you also look at how many ratings each book has received, so I will also mention that. And I will mention whether or not I'm surprised with how high these books were, and if I agree with the average rating, basically. I will of course start with the number 10 and then work my way up to number 1. And I can already tell you that there were quite a few surprises. Now the number 10 spot is a book that I can already agree with because that is Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, which is the first book in the Song of Ice and Fire series. So that one had an average rating of 4.44, which is very high, especially if you consider that it had over 2 million ratings. So it's definitely one of the most popular books here. Now, I will already mention that the second book, so Clash of Kings, was on the number 14 spot, and then on number 3, so we will meet it in a while, we have A Storm of Swords, which is the third book in the series, and that had 4.54, and of course less ratings, but still almost 700,000 ratings. Now, I completely agree with this. It has been a very long while since I've read the series, but I do remember that I liked the first 3 books a lot more than the 4th and the 5th one, so I can definitely see why these are higher in the list. I can't really remember of those 3 which I like more than the other, but it's quite clear that with these things, often a sequel will be higher on the list because only the people that really enjoyed the first one will pick up the sequel. So I think that a 4.44 for the first book is very high, and I would also put it in my top 10, so I agree with that. And I'm also not surprised that it's that high and that so many people have read it because, of course, because of the TV show. I think that even people who don't really read a lot of fantasy will have picked these books up. And if you like the TV show, then it's quite normal that you would also like the books. So for this one, no surprises. I can't say the same about the number 9 though, because that is Ruin by John Gwynne, which has an average rating of 4.45, but it does have a lot less ratings, of course, than Game of Thrones, because here we only have 11,000, a little bit over 11,000 ratings. However, I was still very much surprised about how high this was. Now, Valor, so Ruin is the third one in the series. Valor was number 15 of the books that I've read, or the fantasy books that I've read. So that's still pretty high, but it's quite clear that most fans of the series like Ruin more. Malice I couldn't really see, so I think that it's a lot more down the average rating list. Now, I was very surprised when I saw this, that it was number 9 of all the books that I've read, which is I didn't like it that much. I didn't like the Faithful and the Fallen series that much. It's not that I dislike it very much, it's just that it's an okay series, it's nothing special, and the writing style is not the best in my opinion. But if you like this type of series, then I can definitely see why you like the third one in the series most of all. For me, I actually liked Malice most of the first 3 that I've read, and then it went downhill because it's not my type of series. And each next book in the series was more of what I didn't like. But if you pick it up for what the series is, then I can definitely see that each next book is more of what you like. So looking at it that way, it seems like people who pick up Malice either love it or dislike it. So that would have a lower average rating. And then the few people who do continue with the series absolutely love it, give it all 5 stars. So with that in mind, I can definitely see why the third one in the series is my number 9 here. But still, the first time that I saw this, I was very surprised. I would have never guessed this. And of course, if you have seen a couple of my videos talking about The Faithful and the Fallen, then you would probably guess that I would never put it in my top 10. Then on number 8, we have by far the most popular book on the list, and that is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by, of course, J.K. Rowling. So this one has an average rating of 4.47, but almost 8 million people rated it. So I guess that a lot of people like Harry Potter. I'm not surprised by this. I saw this coming. I know that the Harry Potter fandom is big. A lot of people have feelings of nostalgia toward it. You have the movies that a lot of people loved. So I can understand this. I personally didn't really like the Harry Potter books. I picked them up more than 10 years ago, I think. I didn't even read all of them. I didn't read them in order. And they are fine, but they're, again, not my cup of tea. I don't really like Portal fantasy books. I didn't really like the magic system that you have in there, and I don't really enjoy the main characters that much. I like the movies, okay. The books, not really, but I can definitely see what J.K. Rowling did, even though she's a horrible person. I can see that she's a very good author. And so I do think that she deserves to be this high, but I would never put her this high. Then number 7 is Morning Star by Pierce Brown. This is also the only fantasy sci-fi book on this list. And this had an average rating of 4.47 and more than 100,000 people voted. So it's not the most popular book on the list, but it's also not one of the least popular ones. Now, just for reference, Golden Sun, which is the second book in the trilogy, was on number 12 of this list, so it just was knocked off. And for me, I can definitely understand why it's that high. I also agree a little bit, and the only reason that I kept this one in, by the way, is because it feels very fantasy as well. It's sci-fi light with a lot of fantastical elements, so that's why it's still on the list. And it's definitely one of the books that I enjoy. Would it be my top 10? I don't know. I don't think so. But it would be very high, and I can see why it is that high, and I can agree with it that Pierce Brown did an amazing thing. For me personally, I would definitely swap Golden Sun and Morning Star. And I also understand why Red Rising isn't even near the first 10 or 20 on this list, because one, you have a very big difference in quality, but also, again, it's the first in a series, and I think that a lot of people maybe dropped the series after Red Rising because they didn't really like what was going on there, and then they didn't pick up Golden Sun, which in my opinion is a shame, because Golden Sun is a lot better, and it takes a very different direction than Red Rising. But that's probably why Red Rising had a lot of high ratings and low ratings, and then if you like Red Rising already and you pick up Golden Sun, you're going to love it. Morning Star for me had some issues, especially technical issues with first POV, so that's why maybe reconsidering it doesn't really deserve to be on the top 10 because of that, and I would have swapped it with Golden Sun that didn't have these issues. Next up, number 6, an author that we knew was going to make the list at least once, and that is Brandon Sanderson with The Hero of Ages, the third book in the Mistborn trilogy. This one had an average rating of 4.48 and a little bit over 300,000 votes. So I was a little bit surprised that it had only 300,000 votes, because for Brandon Sanderson I would expect more. However, of course, fantasy, it's still a niche genre, so even though Brandon Sanderson is very much well known in the fantasy community, I wouldn't really say that he's a well-known general author, maybe. I can't really say anything about that because I have no idea. And it's of course the third in a series. So again, not a lot of people are that far into the series. The first one would probably have a lot more ratings. Now, again, just for reference, the first one, so The Final Empire, was at number 11. So again, it barely missed the list. And I definitely agree with this general rating. Now, I must say, of course, here that I haven't read anything for Stormlight Archive, so maybe if I had read that, it would be higher on the list than Mistborn Era 1. But for now, from everything that I have read, I do think that The Hero of Ages is the best book by Brandon Sanderson. I also agree that The Final Empire is a very good book, and The Well of Ascension wasn't really near the top 10. And I also agree with that, because I do think that that book suffers from middle book syndrome, and it has some weird stuff going on, Zane, for example. But for this one, I'm not surprised. I think that Brandon Sanderson is, in terms of fantasy, one of the most well-loved authors. And I also agree with this. I would probably put The Hero of Ages, yes, on my top 10 list and put it over The Final Empire. So with this one, I agree. Then the next one is somewhat of a hidden gem in my opinion, and that is The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden, so that one is on number 5. This is the third book in the Winter Night trilogy, so also the conclusion, and it had an average rating of 4.5 and 50,000 people who rated it. So it's definitely a little bit of a hidden gem. I would recommend you picking it up, and I agree with this. Now, in general, this would be on my top 10. Definitely. I wouldn't have suspected it to be that high because I don't really hear a lot of people talking about it, but I'm very glad that it is and that it's rated quite high. The first and the second book in the trilogy didn't get this high of a rating, but still both of them were above 4, and of course they had more ratings. I think that the first one had 150,000 ratings, so again, it's very normal for the last one to be higher rated than the first two. I don't know if I liked the third one most of all. I think either the first or the second one, but it's very close. In this trilogy, there's definitely not middle book syndrome or anything like that. I liked all three. I think all three of them are also quite distinct. So that's why it's very difficult to rate them. I am going to reread the entire trilogy in a couple of months, so then I might do a review and finally pick my favorite one. But I think that I might put The Bear and the Nightingale, so the first book in the trilogy, higher. But all three of them are 5 stars in my opinion, so it deserves to have the number 5 spot. Then on number 4, another one that I think definitely deserves to be this high, even though not everybody agrees with that. And that is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, with an average rating of 4.51 and almost 800,000 people voted. Now I am going to immediately mention that The Wise Man's Fear, so the second book in this trilogy, is on the number 2 spot, and it has a 4.54 average rating with almost 500,000 people who rated it. Now I don't agree with this, that the second book is higher than the first one, because the first one is A tier, S tier. It's amazing. It's one of the best books that I've ever read. And I think that the second one is fine, it's okay, but it has some weird stuff in it and it's not nearly as good as the first one. Now again, the first one has almost the double amount of ratings, so people who didn't love it gave it a low rating, and people who did love it and continued with the series wouldn't completely hate The Wise Man's Fear. So I suppose that's why. But for me, I would definitely swap the two. And I think that The Wise Man's Fear wouldn't even be in my top 10 because it's a fine book, but it's nothing special, while The Name of the Wind is. So I would put it on my top 10. I am not surprised that it's on the overall top 10 or that it has a pretty high rating of all the books that I have read. And I don't understand people who don't like it. I'm sorry. It's one of those things, I can see why you find it boring, but I think that even if you don't like it, you understand why people do and see that it's such a beautiful writing style. Now, as in general, I don't know if Patrick Rothfuss can really tie up the series nicely, because at the end of the second book, a lot of things need to be tied up, and I don't think that he can make it work in the last final book. And maybe that's why it takes so long. So I am very afraid for the conclusion of the trilogy, but the first 2 books were amazing, at least the first one. And then, of course, number 3 and 2 I already mentioned. So number 3 was A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. Then number 2 was A Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss. But now, the number 1. I was extremely surprised by the number 1. I would have never guessed this because, no, you could have given me 50 chances to guess this one, and I wouldn't have guessed it. Because the number 1 is A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas, with an average rating of 4.59 and 500,000 ratings. I am not going to say anything negative about this series, because to be honest, I like it just fine. It's the second book in this trilogy, by the way, and Agatar is a lot lower. So again, I can definitely understand that people who liked Agatar and then read A Court of Mist and Fury liked it a lot more, because I also liked it a lot more. So that's why it has a high average rating. I can also see that it was first marketed as YA, and as a teenager, if this was marketed YA and I was allowed to buy it from my mom, I would have given it 5 out of 5 stars, because there's smut in it, and as a teenager, of course, why wouldn't you rate it that high? And then after that, it was marketed as adult. So it had those 2 markets, and people who like romance, people who like fantasy, I can understand why it has a high rating, but I would never rate it that high, just because it's fine, but it's not the best out there. In terms of writing style, it's definitely not the worst writing style of this list. Let's put that out there. It's fine. It's nothing special. It's also not bad. It's just fine writing style. You can't really say anything about it positively either. It's not poetic, it's not beautiful prose, it's just there. The characters, well, not the best. Again, it's fine. If you pick this up, you pick it up for the smut and you pick it up for the romance. That's basically it. And that she does perfectly. But to say that this is the best fantasy book that I've ever read, I wouldn't even put it in my top 30, to be honest. So I was super surprised by this, even though after thinking about it, I understand why it's this high. I don't agree with it, one, and I wouldn't have put it this high either for myself. So this one was one that I was double checking if I had really ranked it on average rating, because I couldn't believe this. So yeah, definitely a surprise. So those were the 10 best books according to Goodreads that I've ever read in the fantasy or sci-fi genre. Now I must say that I was surprised for a couple of these, as you have heard, but I was also surprised that some of my favorites weren't really on here. So for me, of course, if I could choose, I would definitely put a Juliette Merlier book on here. I would put a Chronicle of the Unholy Throne book on here. But I'm not surprised that those 2 aren't on the list, because they aren't that well known and they aren't booktube favorites or fantasy fan favorites. However, there wasn't any Robin Hobb book on the list. And that's something that broke my heart a little bit and that I don't understand, because Robin Hobb is pretty well known as a fantasy author, I suppose, especially in the booktube community. And a lot of people agree that The Realm of the Elderlings is one of the best series ever written. So that it's not on the list, I was very surprised by that. And yeah, of course, I completely disagree. It would be number one, or as a series, it would definitely be a number one for me. As one specific book, of course, I would put Daughter of the Forest first, but as a series, I think that The Realm of the Elderlings is amazing. And I can't believe that of the 9 books that I've read in this series, not one of them were in the top 10. Another one that I was surprised by, even though I do agree, is that the Wheel of Time books weren't in my top 10. So I have read the first 4 and I thought that they had a pretty high average rating, but of course, I think that the amount of ratings that they have is humongous probably, so then you have a lot of lower ratings as well, so it evens out a little bit. But I thought that they would be on there somewhere. So definitely a couple of surprises. Please let me know what your highest rated book is that you've ever read, if you use Goodreads, and let me know if you agree with that or if you were surprised as well. As always, I hope that you enjoyed the video and see you next time. Bye!